In 1947, Operation Highjump ended, but the story didn't. The official reports blamed weather, but that's not what people remember. They say the expedition wasn't forced back, it was turned back by something watching. And if that part is even partially true, then what happened next wasn't a retreat, it was an escort. If the skywall was resistance, what happened next in the version that circulates through the Byrd Files feels almost surgical. Byrd is airborne, not scrambling, not retreating, flying steady over an endless white sheet of ice. Below him, Antarctica looks dead. No motion, no texture, just wind carving patterns into frozen silence. Then two objects rise from the horizon line. Not fast, not flashing, just appearing. Angular, disc-like, metallic, but without reflection glare. They don't rush him, they take position. One off the left wing, one off the right, holding formation with impossible precision. He adjusts heading slightly, they mirror him instantly. No delay, no oscillation, perfect symmetry. Compass steady, altimeter steady, radio static clears instead of intensifies. That's important because earlier accounts describe disruption. This doesn't feel like disruption, it feels like control. And that matters because if something wanted to destroy him, it would. If something wanted to scare him, it would destabilise his aircraft. But this is deliberate pacing, deliberate proximity, deliberate restraint. Escort implies permission has been withdrawn. You are no longer flying freely, you are being guided. The two craft begin descending, gradually, measured. Byrd follows, cloud cover thickens around the cockpit, the world fades grey. In polar regions, cloud usually swallows light, but here light begins to glow upwards, not from above, from beneath. The temperature inside the cabin shifts, not dramatic, just enough to register. Instruments remain calm, too calm, no alarms, no warning tones, no turbulence, just smooth descent. And then the cloud layer breaks, not above him, below. And if you think the escort was the story, that was the door. What he allegedly saw next is simply mind-blowing. But before I show you that, we need to go back, because without context, none of it makes sense, and trust me, you won't want to miss the rest of this story. What you're about to hear only makes sense if you understand the man at the centre of it. Admiral Richard Byrd wasn't a fringe explorer chasing myths, he was a decorated naval officer, an aviation pioneer, a man trusted with thousands of personnel and millions of dollars of military hardware. Operation Highjump wasn't a side project, it was one of the largest Antarctic expeditions ever launched. Nearly 5,000 men, aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and it ends earlier than expected. Officially, weather. Unofficially, questions. Watch part 1 from last week. After the operation, Byrd gives interviews. He speaks cautiously about polar regions becoming strategically important. He warns that future aircraft may travel from pole to pole at incredible speeds. That line is usually framed in Cold War context, and that's fair. Long-range bombers were emerging, technology was accelerating, but tone matters. Before Highjump, Byrd speaks like a man exploring the unknown. After Highjump, he speaks like a man who has seen the unknown. That's subtle, but it's there. Now, here's where we have to be disciplined. There's no official military report describing an escort beneath the Antarctic cloud layer. There's no verified transcript of a meeting below the ice. What we're dealing with is a narrative that emerges later. through documents that appear decades after the fact. So the question becomes, why does this version exist at all? Why does the story evolve from conflict to contact? Because if the first encounter was about resistance, the second version suggests something far more controlled, and that's where we return to the descent. We left him at the cloud break, the escort steady, instruments calm, and the white horizon disappears, not because it darkens, because it opens. Below the thinning cloud, the terrain is no longer flat ice, it has depth, contours, green patches interrupting what should be frozen wasteland. Byrd descends cautiously with two craft maintaining position, not aggressive, not celebratory, just precise. The light source feels wrong. At the South Pole, sunlight should rake low across the surface. Long shadows, sharp contrasts, but here the illumination is diffused, even almost internal. There are no blizzards, no violent winds. The air looks calm, too calm for a region known for katabatic gusts capable of tearing steel from structure. As he descends further, scale begins to distort. What looked like minor elevation from above becomes rigid formation. What looked like discoloration becomes vegetation, not dense forest, not tropical canopy, but growth. Patches of green interrupting what should be permanent frost. At the South Pole, that alone should not be possible. The canopy fogs briefly, then clears. Temperature stabilizes at the reading, inconsistent with Antarctic averages. No ice accumulation, no wind shear, no cross-current turbulence. The air mass behaves as if shielded. Then the light doesn't cast long polar shadows. It diffuses outward evenly, like illumination from within enclosure, rather than a distant sun. The descent continues. His altimeter suggests he's below typical polar cloud height, and the escort does not leave. They remain flanking. There are later accounts that describe structured formations in the distance, not cities in the Hollywood sense, but geometric symmetry, linear arrangement, order. Chaos would suggest illusion, order suggests intelligence. Now we need to be disciplined here. There's no official confirmation of an inner world beneath Antarctica, no verified imagery of hidden landscapes below the pole. What we have is a narrative that refuses to disappear because it doesn't describe invasion, it describes hospitality, measured calm, deliberate. If this was hallucination, it was extraordinarily consistent. Hallucinations don't stabilize instruments, they don't maintain escort formation, they don't produce measurable environmental change, which leaves us with two possibilities. Either the story was fabricated or something was witnessed that did not fit the surface model of Antarctica, and that's where this stops being spectacle and starts becoming a meeting. According to the later narrative, Byrd is not attacked, he is not detained, he is not threatened, he is received. The escort gradually peels away, his aircraft stabilizes over what appeared to be controlled airspace. There are descriptions, second-hand, decades later, of structured forms below, orderly, intentional, not ruins, not chaos, organized. And then the claim shifts from landscape to contact. Some versions suggest direct communication, not over radio, not through aviation channels, but mentally, a transmission without sound, no distortion, no static, no dramatic voice from the sky, just clarity. The message in most retellings is calm, measured, clinical. Humanity, it has advanced technologically faster than it has matured ethically, particularly in the realm of weapons, specifically nuclear weapons. The atomic detonations of 1945 are framed as a trigger point, as if something observed them, as if something responded. Now here's what makes this unsettling. The alleged message doesn't threaten punishment, it doesn't promise invasion, it It doesn't claim superiority, it warns, not about war between nations, but about imbalance, about the trajectory of a civilization experimenting with forces it barely understands. And that tone is what keeps the story alive, because it sounds less like fantasy and more like intervention. This account surfaces in a world gripped by Cold War anxiety. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, global fear wasn't invasion, it was annihilation. That doesn't make it false, but it does make it culturally resonant, and stories that resonate persist. The encounter ends as calmly as it began. The escort returns, the descent reverses, clouds reform above him, the temperature drops, instruments remain steady, and Antarctica becomes ice again. If this version is true, then the Sky War wasn't a battle, it was a boundary test, and this was a briefing. So why does this version of events exist at all? Why does the narrative evolve from confrontation to escort to warning? Because stories don't survive for decades unless they attach themselves to something deeper, and this one attaches itself to timing. Operation Highjump happens in 1946 to 1947, just months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world has just learned it can destroy itself completely. The psychological shock cannot be overstated. Humanity didn't just build a bigger bomb, they crossed a threshold. From 1945 onwards, something changes in global storytelling. Reports of unidentified craft increase. Narratives about watchers spike, not invaders, observers, monitors. The tone shifts from "we are alone" to "we are being observed." The pattern is measurable in media, in folklore, in early UFO reports. Now, does that prove contact? No, but it does prove cultural tension, and tension breeds mythology. The Byrd encounter story fits that tension almost perfectly. A respected military leader, a polar expedition, a controlled escort, a warning about nuclear imbalance. It reads like a parable written for atomic age, and that's important because sometimes a story survives not because it happened, but because it expresses a fear people can't articulate directly. And then there's Antarctica itself. Within a decade, the continent becomes internationally regulated. The Antarctic Treaty freezes military expansion. No bases, no weapons testing, scientific cooperation only. Again, completely rational in Cold War context, but symbolism matters. The most remote continent on Earth becomes the most controlled, and that detail feeds the myth, because if nothing unusual ever occurred there, why does it feel guarded? Now, I'm not saying the treaty hides an inner civilization. That would be lazy thinking. What I'm saying is this: Highjump becomes the origin point for a story that refuses to disappear, because it sits at the intersection of fear, technology, and the unknown. And when those three meet, people start connecting the dots, whether they exist or not. So what do we do with this? We have an alleged escort, an alleged warning, a landscape that doesn't behave like surface Antarctica, and a narrative that refuses to die. If even 10% of it is true, then Highjump wasn't the anomaly, it was the introduction.
Right, so let me summarise. You split the atom, flattened two cities, and now you're surprised the universe sends a compliance officer. That is your confusion.
A compliance officer?
Yeah, mate, audit department, interstellar risk management, very boring meetings.
As if, mate. So you're saying that space is treated basically like an Earth office with HR department, admin. I'll tell you what, if there's a payroll, you will be getting sod all.
I once went looking for a woolly mammoth in Iceland, tracked the heat signature for 3 hours, mate. Thought I'd discovered one. Turned out to be frozen food warehouse. Very bloody embarrassing.
Bloody hell, 85, that explains why we had so many chicken nuggets in the freezer, and also that it's not really relevant to this.
You didn't complain while you were eating them though, did you, mate? And it is relevant. You humans are terrible at scale. You see something unusual and you immediately decide it's either nothing or everything. Rarely the correct option.
Mate, that's harsh, but unfortunately true. Anyway, here's the problem. If this wasn't hallucination, and it wasn't myth inflation, then Byrd wasn't escorted into nothing. He was escorted somewhere, and we haven't even addressed the geography properly yet, because the version most people stop at isn't the full version. The full version suggests the landscape itself wasn't just anomalous, it was enclosed, contained structure, and that is where this story stops at being about a warning and starts being about scale. If Antarctica is the boundary, then the real question isn't what fired the warning shot, it's what sits below the line, and that's where we go next week in the trilogy part 3. You will not want to miss that, trust me. Stay curious, my friends. Shane and 85 out.